Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Rutgers Online Learning Conference keynote presentation. My name is Mary Labrada. I'm a senior instructional designer and DEI and STEM specialist for University Online Education Services and your moderator for this presentation. As educators, we guide students in thinking and learning. But how do we ensure technology enhances learning rather than becoming a barrier? Our keynote speaker, Dr. Michelle Miller, professor of psychological sciences and the President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Arizona University, will tackle this question in her keynote address, Realizing the Promise of Teaching with Technology, Minds Online Today. Drawing from her work as a cognitive psychologist, researcher, educator, and author, Dr. Miller's book, Minds Online Teaching Effectively with Technology, has been a key resource for designing memorable, compelling, and effective learning experiences. Today, she'll share insights on how cognitive science informs technology enhanced teaching, along with the challenges and opportunities of AI in education. She is also the author of Remembering and Forgetting in the Age of Technology, Teaching, Learning, and the Science of Memory in a Wired World, and her most recent book, A Teacher's Guide to Learning Student Names, Why You Should, Why It's Hard, and How You Can. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Miller.
All right. Hello, everybody. This is amazing to have this incredibly vibrant group that I've been hearing about already. And I appreciate the introduction and for the opportunity to have some time with you today. So, you heard from this introduction, I'm a cognitive psychologist by training. And so this means that I did my early work in research topics like working memory, the language, attention, and so on. But really, for about the last 15 years of my career, I've refocused on the practical and applied side of this work. Which is bringing the best findings, the most applicable findings from cognitive psychology and other sciences like neuroscience, educational psychology, and so on, and putting those in the hands of people like we have here in our virtual space today, people who are passionately committed to student success, to supporting our students in achieving their goals and dreams, and in weaving in the powers of technologies, which, after all, are rapidly, even today, developing, and we're all looking for ways to harness that to achieve that student success. So I appreciate the warm welcome I'm already seeing in the chat. Now, here's where we're going to take this today. So a little overview of how we're going to spend our time and what to expect. And thank William, Tatiana. I'm seeing all these great chat posts already, and I appreciate it. All right, so here's where we're going to take it today in our time. So we are going to start with this kind of overarching theme, which is the promise of teaching with technology. So we'll dive into that one really momentarily. And then we will get back into one of many frameworks, but the one that I developed years back when I was first grappling with the task of writing the book, Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, and look at some of the implications of that framework and what it can spark and suggest as far as concrete, tangible things that we can design into our courses. And we are going to, especially towards the end of our time, we are going to have some concrete, more concrete and tangible examples, suggestions, and so on, which again can spark our own creativity for how to adapt that for our students in our disciplines. And of course, we will be getting into the topic that is on all educators' minds today, pretty much, which is the arrival of new, easy to use generative AI tools. So that's what we're going to spend our time with today. And that's what I'm so glad that we're all excited and fired up about to revisit these topics. Now, before we do get in, there's a little piece of kind of logistics I want to share with you as well. So this is what I'm terming the companion website to this talk today. It's not something you have to have up with you and be following along. This is something that you can visit anytime. Now, I created this because I am a big believer in providing as many specific references and pointers back to sources for the claims I'm going to make, right? So as a good social scientist, I like to be able to back that up, but it doesn't always make for a nice compact slide design, and not everything fits in the slides or in the limited time we have today. So if you want to visit this anytime, you can find links to the source articles that I'll mention, further research, ideas and examples that didn't fit as well. All right, so that's for you anytime. So let's get back into that big overarching theme for today. What is the promise of teaching with technology? So, if you, like me, have always been really excited about that confluence of new technologies, internet, digital tools, applications, AI, and so on, if you've been excited with how those can blend in with higher learning, with education, that's something that you've been thinking about for a while. So I want to suggest to you and open up an invitation to go ahead and post in the chat. When you hear this deliberately open-ended phrase, the promise of teaching with technology, what sorts of things come to mind? All right, so if I say the grand promise of what technology was supposed to do for education, what comes to mind? So let's see what we can uncover in the chat as far as what this particularly engaged group of educators has to say about the promise of teaching with technology. So let's see what we can bring up in the chat. Okay, all right. So we have easier, right? That students and us as well. Creativity, lots of possibilities. Paperless. So in some ways, can add to sustainability, the possibility for collaboration, flexibility, inclusion, access, civility and ethics bound, worldwide access. Love it. All right. Inclusive of different styles, scale. Okay, reaching more, perhaps more individuals than we ever could before. Convenience especially for our students as well, and dynamic. Open it up. All right, so these are exactly the types of things and themes that I love to hear from faculty now that I get to spend so much time working directly with faculty. So you've covered kind of a wider range than the very basic list that I came up with when I sat with this question myself. So with respect to the many additional nuances that were brought up just now, here are some things that, again, come to my mind and almost always come up when I do talk with groups of engaged educators. So, yeah, absolutely. The access theme, and especially worldwide access. So, let's say it's not feasible for me to say relocate and take time out to do the what's now called a classic or traditional face-to-face degree earning on-site program. I can do that now in a variety of modalities if I'm place bound or even if I have kids at home, right? And this I can earn a degree, I can advance my skills, earn a certificate at primarily at home. So that's one thing that I think absolutely comes up. Access. More people than ever before can access more kinds of education. And yeah, there's this quality or better outcomes, the power theme that comes up as well. So however we want to define it for our own discipline, our own students, more and deeper learning in less time. Oh, and we have a wonderful example of access that just showed up in the chat as well. Students deployed in Afghanistan in online classes, right? Okay, absolutely. And then there's engaging, or you could even roll the fun factor into this. I saw the word fun go by. Say, well, more of us are being skeptical about what used to be called the digital natives idea that, oh, if you're X, whatever the age or generational cutoff is, that you just have to have technology. And I think that more of us are saying, well, not necessarily. It's a little bit more complicated than that. However, there are plenty of times when technology can allow us to do something in a more fast-paced or immediate way. Maybe we can bring in some fun multimedia or game elements. So engaging or a fun factor as well. But the one that really gets me excited and the one that I like to highlight when I do work with faculty is this one. So a driving theme for Minds Online and pretty much all of my subsequent work on educational technology, which is that it enables us to actually make concrete, to actually put into practice this vast and ever-growing body of research on how people learn. So when we can bring those two things together, I think that magic can happen. All right, so that last theme, not exclusively, but that last theme you're really going to see come up in the rest of our time today. So diving into what do we mean by this body of research on how people learn and how we could use that to make technology choices and use technology in particularly powerful ways. Well, again, I'm not the only person who's tackled the idea of coming up with a framework for this. But when I did sit down to write the book, Minds Online, now 10 years ago, hard to believe, but that's when I was doing this, I said, all right, I'm facing a research literature that even for me, a specialist in this area, is overwhelming. Um, but I said, how can we kind of divide this up and create a coherent framework to make it a more manageable topic that we can get our arms around as teachers? So the Minds Online framework divides us up the processes that go on in the mind during learning. Again, not exclusively, but these three are really, really key. And time and again, I've seen this be a catalyst for faculty to say, you know what, here's how I'm going to bring in or refine the technologies that I use in my courses. So attention, memory, and thinking. All right. So when we do this, the most relevant and applicable research findings and principles kind of naturally come to the fore. So we're going to be unpacking each one of these and looking at them from these different angles and also looking at how they can inform our instructional choices and our technology choices. But just to set the stage here, here's some key things that I mean by each one of these three big areas of what happens in the mind during learning. So it starts with attention. And when I went to write Minds Online, I was surprised at how few books and frameworks started with this attention factor. Because we know as cognitive psychologists that pretty much anything that interesting that's going to happen in the mind, whether it's learning new knowledge or acquiring a skill or solving a problem, attention is first on the scene. So it stands to reason to me that we as instructors, especially those in online modalities where we don't get to be there with the students, we have to think about where students' attention is going during learning and how to maximize that. And then there's memory. Now, I've been around a long enough to have realized that when I bring this up, I have to tread carefully, right? So, especially among a group like this of educators, we have to think about, all right, qualifying this. So, memory is an area where we have done so much research in cognitive psychology, and there's a tremendous amount that we can actually use. However, this is not to imply that memory is the only or even the highest aim of our teaching or that it's all about memorization. Now, as we'll see later on in our time together, there are some ways in which memory and knowledge actually complement higher order thinking. So it's not the either or choice that we were perhaps led to believe early in our teaching careers. I know I was. But it is still a very important thing. So memory, not the only thing, but one important component of learning. And it does feed into what, for people like us, is the most important aim of our teaching, which is developing students' thinking skills, right? So while content knowledge definitely complements this, students need practice. And that's something we will be talking about in some depth later on. All right, so attention, memory, thinking. Just this helps us organize this, again, vast body of knowledge and start to think about how those three things are addressed in the learning experiences that we create for students. So, diving in with attention. So, a few very select key principles that I like to share with educators everywhere I go when it comes to attention. Here they are. So, one of the really cool things about studying attention is that we actually don't have a working or a formal definition of what it is in cognitive psychology. So there, and similarly, there's no like one attention spot in the brain or anything like that. But we do know what attention is for, and we do kind of know what attention is not. So attention is actually a set of mechanisms that operate in the mind and in the brain. And it's all about prioritizing. So the purpose of attention is to prioritize and allocate resources. Now, I like to steer people away from thinking of attention like attention span or something like that, like it's a timer in the head, right? Almost like, oh, I'm at the hotel jacuzzi and I set it to 20 minutes, and after 20 minutes, it clicks off and that's it. It's a lot more elastic and a lot more contextually determined than that. But we do know that every moment that you are awake, your attentional mechanisms are prioritizing to say, what are the most important concerns right now, and how can I allocate resources accordingly? So that's what attention does, even if we don't quite know what it is. And one dominant principle that we do all agree on about attention as well is that it is limited. That's sort of its defining feature. As much as we would like to infinitely grow more of it, that doesn't seem to be a possibility. And I say it draws on a common source. Now, by this, I mean, we have to remind ourselves there's not like a separate bank of attention for, say, solving these math problems and my homework exercises, and then a separate bank of attention for worrying about how I'm going to pay my rent, or the anxieties that I might have about mathematics. All of those tap out of the same kind of bank account of attention. So if one is drawing on too much power, it doesn't leave enough left over for the learning. And this does bring up a similar, more technical concept of cognitive load. Now, this one, I say it is more technical, and so I don't like to totally dive into it in a limited time like what we have today. But basically, the cognitive load concept tells us that during learning, right, especially challenging higher learning, there's a certain amount of attention, usually a pretty substantial amount, that is consumed just by that learning, right? So um, to do the math problems, to learn to conjugate French verbs or design a psychology study, that takes a good solid amount of it. So anything that detracts from that, like poor design in an online course so that everything you need is not readily available and you're constantly having to drop what you're doing and hunt for the tool you need, that will detract from learning. So that's more or less the cognitive load concept in a nutshell. And the last big point for teachers is the tight linkages between attention and memory. So the more we research it, the more we realize that attention and memory cannot be separated. And especially when we're talking about forming new memories or new learning, that requires focused attention. So sadly, for students who think that, or those of us, the rest of us who think that we can learn by osmosis, that things soak in passively, that does not seem to be the case. All right, so those are the big abstract principles. What does it look like in practice? So here are some practical suggestions that I like to highlight for teachers and instructors. So first of all, responding. So you'll see that I'm inviting folks to respond throughout our time together. That really works in synchronous environments, but even in asynchronous environments, having times when students stop out and have to do something, tell me what you think, do a review question, that should help maintain that attention. I think it's fine to have lots and lots of text in for folks to read in a college or graduate level online course, for example. Nothing wrong with that. But we have lots of clever ways, unlike with a traditional paper textbook, we can interject, we can change the pace, and we can put it back on the reader or the student to actively respond. So that's one factor we can put in our favor. Another is automaticity. So this is a really old concept in cognitive psychology, but it is one that has stood the test of time. So I always love to share this one. So when we learn complex skills that have maybe sub skills to them, when we practice and practice and practice, those can become automatic, meaning that they take less out of that attentional attentional bank account or attentional resource. Maybe not zero, but over time they will take less. And that opens up all kinds of possibilities and leaves us left over for the challenging aspects of learning. Now, I always like to ask people, because there's really great examples of this in everyday life. Let's see in the chat, What are some examples of perhaps a learning situation from your life where something that initially took so much of your attention, you practiced it and it became automatic, and now there's more left over for other things while you're engaging in that skill. So I'm leaving that really, really open. I'm seeing if we can elicit some examples in our chat. So anything that Oh, okay, Brian. This is a wonder for those who drive. What Brian has put forth. Uh, think about it. When you were a teenager and you were learning, just keeping the car on the road, that took everything. You couldn't have a conversation. You shouldn't have been fooling with the radio. And now, while we sometimes push it a little bit more than we have to, routine driving we can do almost without a whole lot of attentional resources. Cooking, right? So once we know the recipe and we know the basic processes, we can have 3 or 4 dishes going at a time. Canvas. Okay, Danielle, that one's a little on the nose, but yes, exactly. For us as teachers, we were first figuring out like how to have a synchronous course meeting. That was lots of attention. Trail running. If you look up, you're going down. Musical instruments. This is another wonderful example. Now, we can transplant this more or less into some aspects of our teaching. So, here's what I'd like for us to think about now. In what you teach, and you may want to actually put this in your chat post. Tell us what you're teaching. What are some skills, kind of the lower level skills that maybe you as an expert doesn't take anything out of your attention bank or does takes very little, but for your students, they have to drop everything and focus on that, much like a beginning driver. And I can throw out in my discipline, for example, everybody's favorite citation style, APA, American Psychological Association. So when I'm typing my brilliant literature review, I don't have to drop everything and go, oh my gosh, where does the semicolon go? Put my citation in, no big deal, and I don't lose my train of thought. But your students, that's a very different story. All right, so we have some examples. Evaluating sources, right? That can become nearly automatic. Learning new technology tools, right? And more of us are saying just because students are young does not, if they are, doesn't mean that they can just pick up any technology. They need practice with it. Reading research articles. How do you even get in there and get the information out of the article in the first place? Cardiac arrest treatment. Okay. That Brittany, thank you for sharing that one. That raises a lot of questions for me. But I say it can be very discipline specific. Theoretical concepts of in child development. All right. So this is a great one to reflect on and say, maybe we need to actually do some assignments first. And this is what I do, for example, in my fully online writing and psychology course. So we do worksheets, we have back and forth, we have opportunity for feedback to make sure they've got that citation style down pat before we start wading into the deep end of putting together a big conceptual literature review. So this is something we can do. And then lastly, oh, Brittany, thank you. Okay, good. And thank you. Paramedics are underappreciated and incredibly important. All right, so back to how can we get this on our side? So addressing myths. This is another one that I like to do directly with students, and I've done this in a variety of projects. So especially if we do have younger students who may have picked up this digital natives idea, oh, I can just text 5 friends and do my OChem homework and sit in a different lecture and it'll work out. If they have that idea, it's a good thing to engage them in dialogue and kind of address it directly. So one of the projects I wanted to share with you that relates to this is the Attention Matters Project. Now, this is something that ran at my institution for a number of years. We sunsetted it a few years ago, but I still have all the materials and I'm happy to provide any of them to folks who want to adapt them for their own use. So basically, this was a module that students could do for extra credit in a variety of courses that instead of just telling students, put down your phones, you kids and your phones, with that tone, or sending them out to read a bunch of research articles. We engage them in discussion posts based on demonstrations of attention phenomena that we created for them or gathered for them. And it was an amazing window into how students do struggle with things like turning their phones off during class. And we also provided tools for how do you set something like an intention to turn your phone off during class and actually stick to that over time. And we address things like the learning by osmosis myth that, yeah, just because you're in the class doesn't mean that you're going to pick up important information unless you're focused. So I would say, I would encourage you, even if you don't use a structured program like Attention Matters, we now know, especially with online students, fully online students in online degree programs, they really grapple with this on a daily basis. And not only can they benefit from support and information, they can provide information to others and give everybody else good ideas about how to stay focused in a very challenging environment like a fully online and sometimes asynchronous class. So that's something, that's another tactic that we can take. Now, lastly, as far as tools, one of the wonderful ironies of our age is that there are technologies that help us control our other technologies. So, and these here too, these many of these were suggested to me by students. So, what I've shown on the screen just as visual placeholders, there is. Uh, there's a program called Freedom. Now, this one is paid, but it does allow you to set limits and blocks across multiple devices. So you could block anything from online shopping to email or whatever you find that is your problem site for certain periods of time, or set it on a timer. Just having students be sure that they know how to use focus mode or similar features in different smartphone operating systems. Self control is a free and pretty bomb proof web blocker, which again lets you say, for this amount of time, you're not going to let me go on this site. And my students also have told me about another application called Forest, which is more geared to sort of gamifying not picking up your phone. So those are some that we can share as well. Okay, so now switching gears to memory, our second kind of big area that I feel like we can share some important principles. So, learning about memory and kind of taking this on as a faculty member, what I always like to start with is not a bunch of theory or involved jargon or anything like that, but inviting folks to really examine their inner metaphor of what memory is. So here's the thing, especially if you took psychology courses a while ago, you may have come away with a very mechanical idea of what memory is. So uh, comes in through eyes and ears, it goes into short-term memory, like a assembly line gets shipped to long-term memory, gets shipped back to short-term memory, and so on. And very few theorists these days actually subscribe to that. And they also really agree that our memories are definitely not like the hard drive on your computer or the video camera on your phone. Human memory is a lot more selective than that. So I encourage folks, don't think of memory as a place to put things in your mind or in your brain. Think of it as an adaptation that allows you to achieve your goals and survive in the world. So human memory, very selectively, is out there picking up on information that looks like it's going to be really immediately relevant. And nothing else tends to register, right? So it's a good thing that we don't remember everything that's in front of us. That would not be a very adaptive type of system. But it does mean that we have to challenge that idea that, okay, just because I was in front of the information, it's naturally going to somehow register in some kind of security camera in the head, which I assure you we don't have. And here's another important principle that's really come out in research that was done since Minds Online was originally published. And that is more research that shows that memory kind of complements the development of higher order thinking skills. So while I was kind of sold on the idea as a beginning teacher that do you want them to remember facts or do you want them to be able to think, pick one, it looks like now that the more firmly established that you have knowledge in some particular area, the better you can engage in higher order thinking skills. So that is a really, really great thing. Great, great. And Helen's got a great, has posted a good book recommendation. I will definitely check that one out. Okay, so with those ideas in mind, that memory is not like a video camera, it supports our goals, and it actually coexists very nicely with the development of thinking skills. Here are some things that determine what we will actually remember. So, first of all, meaning and structure. And that makes sense from that adaptive point of view, right? If I understand it and if I can fit it into a set of other facts that I know about that area, I'm going to pick that up, right? And it leads to this rich get richer effect in memory as well. So, another good reason to have our students developing a rich base of knowledge in an area, because when they get new facts and ideas that come in, they can better register those in their memory. And then there's the depth of processing concept, another really old one that has stood the test of time in cognitive psychology. Now, even if you've never heard this formal term, I would bet that most of you have hit on this in your own teaching one way or another. Basically says that what we do with information when we're first encountering it really has a lot to do with whether we remember it in the future. So deep processing is essentially any kind of effortful grappling with something on a meaningful level. So things like rank ordering a set of ideas from most to least important, or comparing and contrasting. We do that, becomes memorable. And here's the virtuous cycle that can happen is, okay, I'm doing a deep thinking exercise with this material. I'm going to remember it better. And then when I remember it better, I'm better able to reason in that area. So that's another really great thing we can set up. This one is a bit of an oddball, but I do like to mention it, which is that in general, information that is presented to us in a compelling visual way, or that we internally visualize, is more memorable than other types of information. So probably this is an artifact of the fact that our cortex is about a third devoted to visual processing. So there's a lot of neural machinery that supports visual processing. Visual information tends to be memorable. The timing also matters. So this is another very well-established principle, and one that directly relates to how we structure learning and encourage students to study. And this is spacing or distributed practice. So essentially the principle is, if you have some fixed amount of time you're going to study or work with information, you will retain more from that amount of time if it's spread out into smaller, shorter, more widely spaced intervals. And it's not just because taking breaks is good. We actually know a little bit about the neuroscience and the underpinnings of why this works. But yeah, spacing the practice, better retention in the same amount of time. And then retrieval practice. And this is the superstar of all applied memory research going back for the last 30 years. So retrieval practice. So we're going to take a special look at this one. So retrieval practice, if you're not familiar with it or you need a refresher, it's any time I effortfully pull information out of memory instead of, say, referring to an external source, right? This can, of course, be a test or a quiz, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be a brain dump. Write down everything that you remember from the last module or from the last time we had a synchronous class meeting. So that is also retrieval practice. Study group or a quiz game that I engage in with my friends, that's also retrieval practice. And here's the thing is study after study after study has shown that time spent on retrieval practice will produce better results in terms of memory than anything else you can do with the time. And that's a big statement. We don't make a lot of big blanket statements like that in my field, but that one we can stand by. And this is not just something demonstrated like one or two studies. This is a large body of research, and more studies are coming out on this all the time. And I've shown on the screen here, just again, kind of a one landmark review. All goes all the way back to 2008. That was already showing how powerful retrieval is for learning. But there, as I said, there are more that come out all the time. It's not something that just lasts until the end of the psychology study. It lasts for on the order of months or more. The benefits do. Works for complex materials, not just contrived psychology study materials, that type of thing. And in particular, Retrieval practice produces better results in less time than what for many students is their go-to study activity, which is rereading or reviewing. And by that, we mean usually a fairly passive process of going over it with a highlighter or scrolling it on a screen, right? So retrieval practice, closing the screen, closing the book, doing some retrieval, that will blow doors off of that typical study process. Retrieval practice in writing papers, flashcards, good. Yes. So getting into what does that look like in practice? So applying those principles, of course, with spacing. And here's where the flexibility of an online course design is really, really beneficial. So if we're clued into this principle, we can, in our designs, continually push students toward that shorter, more frequent sessions. We can play with different requirements or encouragements for students to log in more frequently. We can break down big assignments and big assessments into almost infinitely smaller, more spaced chunks. And lots of people are doing this. There's lots of good reasons to do that. The lower stakes, frequent assessment design. Although it is sometimes a good idea to maybe revisit things like very strict deadline policies, and that's a big one. So I'm just going to make it as a suggestion. But as the deadlines get more complex, it may make sense to say, look, just communicate with me if something's late. Let's not start docking things or say no late work is accepted. So spacing, very well suited to online course design. Now, anytime we can have that deep processing as well, so synthesizing information, relating it to yourself, discussion boards, these are often maligned, but I think that these do work well, especially when we're asking students to use them as a space for that deep processing. So explain like how a psychology principle has played out in your own life if there's something you're comfortable sharing, or tell me about a time when this was something that you accessed in or experienced in your own life. Visuals. So, as experts, we can and probably should be selecting really good multimedia for our online course experiences. So, interactive diagrams, things like videos, if we can vet the content, that presentation methodology can be very powerful. And of course, retrieval practice. That's something we absolutely want to tap into no matter what we're doing. So that can look lots of different ways. I love the traditional pre-class reading quiz. I like to make quizzes like that repeatable, so you just keep the highest grade. Self quizzing. If you have open-ended questions or short essays, things like that that students are creating or putting into a Google Doc in real time, those are things that you can also do spot grading. So I don't feel like the need like I have to go through every single one and line edit it. I've even in a large class said, hey, I'm going to pull a certain proportion of these for um, a closer look. And for if you're not selected, everything else, any good faith effort gets full credit. So that can work too. So choosing the tools and resources that make quizzing easily. And so here's a few that will, and I'm sure there will be some familiar ones for this group today. So technology tools for memory retrieval. Here's where technology has opened up all kinds of avenues for actually putting this principle into practice. And I say this because, I mean, back in the 90s when I was in grad school, we were already learning about retrieval practice, but we didn't have any practical ways to access that and tap into it and build it into a course. So people like me were doing things like bringing a U-Haul box literally every single week to my intro to psychology course just to run a quiz one time. And now the opportunities are nearly limitless. Now, flashcards, as Brian were pointing out, flashcards are wonderful when they are used for retrieval practice. And because where there's now applications that can go anywhere, you can take advantage of distributed practice as well. You're waiting for your kids at soccer practice, pull out your flashcard deck. And of course, Quizlet is an old favorite that my students really like. Brainscape is a relatively newer arrival on the scene, but it has, and it's a freemium type of model, but it has the ability to generate cards in an area, take your study materials and turn those into flashcard decks. I'm currently using it myself for a learning project, so I think that's really excited. We have make your own Jeopardy games. Exactly. So definitely add to these tools. This is wonderful. Um, Top Hat, if you've ever used that, it's a little bit more oriented towards hybrid or face-to-face, inclusive environments, but it has lots of opportunities to ask questions, let students ask questions during a class, and so on. I have a little placeholder here for just the old-fashioned learning management system quiz, which I think is still a viable thing if you've talked to your students about why we have so many quizzes and why you actually want to try them as a low risk way of advancing your learning quickly. And of course, Kahoot. And I bet that we do have a lot of Kahoot users here. And again, for those who aren't as familiar or would like to just know a little bit more, what Kahoot is it does one thing and does it really well, which is it has gamified quizzes that are tend to be very fast paced. You get a score, there's winners, and so on. But the really neat thing that I hit on years ago during our hybrid instruction here at my university is this is one of the few tools that actually works when you have some students here in person, some back home synchronously, and some asynchronously. So you can set up these Kahoot quizzes, say, in an asynchronous course, as I do, for students to do on their own time. And I also like to open up a few sessions each week to say, hey, if you log on during this synchronous time, it's not required, but I will play this quiz game with you. And it's nice because I can also then address anything they got wrong and we can explain that and talk about it. So we have these little sessions where you can come and play against your classmates and get some input from me. Now, because they're timed, that introduces some complexities for students who have lower processing times for whatever reason. So I don't like to give a grade based on the points you earn, which are a function of correct answers and speed. But I do have students turn in a short reflection. So you log in, you tell me what your score was, the name you used when you were playing, and then give me 3 to 6 sentences saying, hey, how did it go? Did you do better than you thought, worse than you thought? Are you improving? It's really fun to read those reflections evolving over the course of a semester. So that's how that can look. Now, taking on this kind of pinnacle of what we as engaged teachers want for our students, the thinking skills. So here again, some core principles to take home. So when we use this term thinking, that is also necessarily broad, and I'm okay with that. So when we say thinking, that's going to look very different in different disciplines and settings and levels. It can include everything from practical problem solving that you might see in a nursing course or an engineering course to formal mathematical reasoning or logic like you'd see in a philosophy class, and everything in between. So basically the application of what we know and creating new ideas and original applications. So, one of the big issues for teaching thinking skills is this fact about human cognition, which is that it tends to be very context bound, context specific. So, much as we would like to be reinforcing just thinking skills in general, that is a really tough thing to do. I think that there's something that happens as far as a general abstract thinking ability that can develop over the years in higher education, but for the most part, like when I learned to say troubleshoot a psychology experiment, that's not going to help me troubleshoot car trouble that I'm having. If I'm learning formal logical reasoning in my philosophy class, that won't necessarily directly pop back up in my nursing course that I'm taking. So thinking skills do tend to be context specific. And far and away, the biggest issue that we run into as teachers is the issue of transfer. And here's something where I would invite folks to post in chat as well. Great examples that you might come up with, and we all have them, of this now you see it, now you don't phenomenon in teaching. Is like, you know that the students got this principle or skill in the last module. We changed the context a little bit, and now where did it go? So if you have any examples of those, please feel free to post them. And this doesn't reflect poorly on your students or on your teaching. There's nothing necessarily wrong. That's just the way the human mind tends to work. So transfer can be very, very challenging. And definitely if you have examples of the transfer woes that we all face, feel free to share those. So how do we address these barriers and challenges? Well, it turns out that retrieval practice is kind of a twofer here. So it's just that powerful. So there is some relatively new research emerging showing that when students do retrieval practice, again with some knowledge in an area, that that helps support them in transferring what they know to new situations and settings later on. And also it helps them draw inferences, which to me is a very important higher thinking skill, the ability to say, okay, we know this, here's what happened over here. What do we predict is going to happen over here? So if you're not already using quizzing, retrieval practice, and sharing that power with your students, this isn't yet another good reason to do it. All right, and we have some good examples that are showing back up in the chat. So ESL students transferring their ability to write correct sentences to speaking correct sentences. It can seem like two totally different classes, but it's the same language. Transition from textbook to language. Oh my goodness, in the wild. That's ultimately where we want transfer to happen, right? Is in the workplace or where we're going to go next with this, right? Perfect examples there. All right, so in practice, well, it starts with us. It starts with us saying, all right, let me reflect on what the thinking skill actually is. So because thinking skills do look very different in different contexts, we have to take a step back and say, well, here's what I want for students. And many design experts have counseled this, something very similar to backward design, if you're familiar with that. So saying not just the content we want to have in the course, let's focus on what should students be able to do at the end that they couldn't do at the beginning. All right. And then making sure we align the practice students are doing to that. And that may sound very obvious, but I will tell you, those things tend to drift apart. It's almost like tectonic plates over time. So I like to, every few semesters, at a minimum, say, all right, what do I really want as a skill? Where is the student time going in this course? Right? And in online courses, especially if they're asynchronous, here's where I also like to reinforce transparency. So students kind of have a sense of, all right, here's what she's trying to reinforce. Here's the skill I'm trying to acquire. So I do like to have students either require or heavily encourage them to make an appointment with me. I actually use a calendaring program that makes it easy to slot all those in. Everybody has a slot and a time to talk with me about their goals for the course and my goals for the course, and we can find where those two things intersect. Okay, so looking at transfer as well. So with an eye to the fact that it's not enough just to get it for one module or one course, transfer is the issue. You get transfer through a long process of grappling with problems that look very different on the surface, but are very similar underneath, have similar common underlying elements. All right, this is a big one. This is a big concept. So here too, if you have examples of how you might do this or anything drawn from your own field, please share those in the chat. So, for example, I know as an expert, when I open up a psychology study to read, it's probably got similar components underneath. There's variables, there's different statistics and methodologies, and I can zoom right to those, even though on the surface they may look like very different experiments or studies. My students don't necessarily know that yet. They treat every study as, as a brand new one off. So, when I present them time and again, here's a study, tell me what the variables are. Here's a study, what was the design? Was it experiment or correlation? They learn to drill down to those elements. So that's something very important. As we touched on, quizzing can also be helpful here too. And lastly, scenarios. One really good thing that we do have going for us is that people are pretty good about developing these skills through even hypothetical scenarios. So we'll look at a few examples of tools that can do this in a second, but methods like case studies, problem-based learning, even role playing, whether it's online, face-to-face, or some combination, those are very, very powerful. And I would bet in a group like this that there are people who are using one or more of these. So here again, if you want to endorse or share how you do that in your courses, let us know. So tools. Now, once again, I would not encourage us to all go looking for some program or app that will teach students to think across the board in some generic way. I don't think that's ever going to exist. But especially in asynchronous courses, there are discipline specific and sometimes very skill or content specific applications out there that we can find as the experts who we know if there's quality and if it is addressing what we wanted to address. So just a few little hints here. We have I have a few pictures connected on the screen connected to Sniffy the rat. He is a simulation of a rodent who's in a little training piece of equipment that you would use to teach, as millions of psychology students have now used this to learn principles of learning, things like reinforcement and rewards and punishments and negative reinforcement and so on. And he's a lot better than having to learn this from a real rat the way that we did back in the early days of psychology instruction. So you don't have to have a rat in your house, and he doesn't bite. So that is one example of a simulation that can be very powerful. CogLab lets you simulate important experimental paradigms from home. So in cognitive psychology, our experiments are they're kind of weird if you've ever read one. They're hard to pick up on just from reading about them. But this lets students role play the experience of being a research volunteer to better understand these paradigms. And in STEM, more of these come out all the time. University of Colorado Boulder, for example, has run a free to use set of interactive simulations for years that can help students develop understanding of concepts in physics, biochemistry, and more. So if there's a simulation that's out there in your field that you can use that does align to the principles that you're trying to help students develop, those are things that we can draw on. Now, the other the other topic on everyone's mind. So what comes on when we bring AI into the mix? Now, with our just kind of limited time here, I'm not going to be real precious about the terminology or dividing up all the different kinds. We can just by AI. I mean things like the readily available Chat GPT and similar tools that are out there. And just since we've been talking today, probably more of them have been invented. So I think for simplicity's sake, it makes sense. And I have up on the screen one of my very first little tentative prompts that I used some time ago when I was taking my first course in prompt writing. So one of the very basic things you see I was trying to do with this AI prompt is retrieval practice. So I was reading an article, it was a little out of my field. I wasn't quite sure if I understood it. So I said, I'm going to take my own medicine. I'm going to see if it can create some questions and give me feedback. And it worked really, really well, even with this very basic prompt. So what a new tool for engaging in retrieval practice. So, for those who are kind of grappling with this and are more at a starting point, here's some suggestions that I've written about and I want to share with you. And here too, one of the things that I've really counseled and written about for faculty is I'm very deliberately separating out the issue of academic dishonesty with AI from more positive uses of AI. I think it's too complex to try to deal with both at once. So this is, but there's lots of great webinars out there that deal with the academic dishonesty. We're going to put a pin in that one today. But starting points for incorporating it in other ways into a course itself. I think we can't go wrong if we use those same principles that have been so powerful in guiding us with other technologies, the retrieval practice, spacing, active engagement, creating messy problems for students to grapple with so they get transfer and so on. It's also really good since there is a learning curve here to use it for the things that students are doing really well on. Let's aim it at those areas that we know time and again students are going to struggle with or not succeed. So let's point it at the most difficult, challenging parts of the course. We can create assignments that are not all or nothing. So you can tell students, okay, here for this part, I want you to do this without AI. Here's where I want you to engage with an AI tool, maybe to review what you've come up with and so on, and maybe dip back out of AI at that point. So we can get very creative with this. Another principle is to use your own professional practice as a guide. So I don't think that we can say, let's say prepare all students everywhere for some AI future in a workplace. I can't picture that. But I can picture what psychologists of the future are going to do and where AI might be very important. And once I've used it, I can not only tell students how to use it themselves from an informed perspective, I can easily weed out those AI tools which, shocker, don't work as well and aren't as useful as they're marketed to be. So doing that, and of course clarifying our purpose, saying why, what am I most wanting to do out of all the possible options for what's the goal of bringing this in? Not doing it just to do it, but is it to enhance the learning, to help them develop their skills with AI, to help them refine their work, and so on. And here's last kind of point where I'm going to invite us to add to what I have here. So when I sat down with a colleague and just said, what's a kind of a little brainstorm of all the different ways that we could bring AI into a course, specifically aligning with the memory and thinking skills part of it, here's just a list that we came up with right off the bat. All right, yeah, so that's really awesome. So we've got we've got some good suggestions coming up here in the chat as well. So everything from making the process of writing Kahoot questions quicker and easier to um, things like creating those problem solving scenarios for students to grapple with. These are all ways that we can now engage with this new technology, not from ground zero, but using some of the concepts that have already been so helpful in selecting other technologies planfully. So I've got one last chat invitation. What else would you add, especially if you have different kinds of online modalities? So, what are some other AI applications, ways of using it that can either bring richer learning to students, increase the fun factor, bring in more retrieval practice, or anything else? Feel free to share those with your colleagues here. So, with that invitation, and we may see some of these ideas building up in our chat here. Generating flashcard content. Yes, and absolutely. And I think we're going to see more tools for doing this as well, Michael. So that's a really good one. Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible golden age for retrieval practice, that's for sure. So returning to our promise. So I hope that our time together today has given you some ideas for how we can bring more learning to more people than we've ever seen before. Using technology, the good sides of technology for our own purposes to increase the outcomes, right? So to ensure that more students leave with a better grounding and more transferable knowledge that they can use in the future, that they are more actively engaged in the process of their own learning, and definitely tapping into learning sciences, both the classic research and the research that's coming out every day. So that is what I want to leave you with as you head into the rest of this experience with the online con. How can we realize the promise that I believe very much is still there and is still evolving? All right. So with that, we're going to have a brief question and answer with our time that we have. I have up on the screen an absolutely authentic invitation to you. All the ideas I get come from my fellow faculty, so I very much want to be connected to you. LinkedIn is sort of my social media of choice, such as it is. I will put a clickable link here in the chat as well. So we've got this. I have a free Substack newsletter that is all about recent research in learning sciences that you're welcome to check out as well. And I hope that we can be in touch. Always feel free to email me with any questions that didn't get addressed, feedback, or other ideas. And here's another link to our companion website. So with that, I'm going to ask our facilitator to see if there's questions that can be addressed or where we should take it from here in our last few minutes.
So we do have a few minutes, and we do have a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
The question reads, is there a difference between using different types of retrieval, verbal discussion, written summaries, visual representation, quizzes, etc.?
Okay. Right. So kind of getting into, and I love this, the finer points of retrieval practice. I mean, the first kind of big take home point is that no matter the format, Some retrieval practice is better than none. So there's virtually no format. Even something like a basic multiple choice question is still going to produce benefits. However, no surprise to those of us who are expert teachers, the more active effort that students put into it, you just see those benefits multiply and accrue. So if you can have something like open-ended questions, and AI now gives some good options for giving feedback on those that aren't as labor intensive. If students can do that, that will produce even more benefits. As far as the visual representation, that one I am not as sure that we have a big well of research on that. However, things like sketching or drawing, not just doodling, but if it's really connected to the content and it is very visual type of content, if students grapple with that process of sketching it out, you should, in theory, also find some real kind of deep processing there as well. So, for example, in one of my courses, students actually mock up an idea for an application um, that relates to psychology. I'm always fascinated when I try to do this, when I see my students doing it, how that really forces us to think about the information in a different way compared to just a very superficial verbal description. So that's what I would say to that excellent question. So what else do we have?
We do have another question. How do you encourage slash motivate students to willingly grapple with learning when offloading the learning to AI may be tempting?
Yeah, maybe tempting. And here, this is something that I think more of us are also going to be discussing, um, and a number of us have come at this question in different ways. Like, for example, Dave Cormier, who's a pioneer in massive open online courses. I recently saw in a talk, he said something along the lines of, you know what, we don't get to send students home to do work that they that they do not voluntarily want to do. That's not a thing anymore. Um, I've come at this from a concept I call teaching from the same side as part of a little essay I posted in that Substack that I shared with folks a little while ago. And I'll put that link back up. And I'm still kind of working on, all right, what does that physically look like? But in our language with students, in how we assess them, maybe looking at something like collaborative grading, which makes it very concrete that, yeah, we're on the same side. It's you and me, maybe versus some material that's challenging. But I don't think that we can have this very adversarial view of like, I have the points and I'm going to dole out points and take the points away in exchange for these little pieces of work, because students do need to have some intrinsic or a great deal of intrinsic motivation to do this. And it doesn't hurt to just also do a basic things like orienting them to retrieval practice, saying, hey, you know what? Yeah, you could probably find a way to cut and paste these questions, but they're here to help you build this knowledge, and you're here to do that as well. So I think through a combination of transparency, kind of some basic motivational theory, being very careful about how we communicate and think about our relationships with students and the learning, we will start to see some solutions emerge. But that is definitely a timely question.
Okay, and we can take one more question since the next session start at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
We have, thank you, Dr. Miller, for the
Oh,
presentation.
oh, thank you so much. What a great group. And this chat, hasn't it been wonderful? I mean, and this is what I think the
Oh,
power of
there's
this
still,
type
excuse
of
me, there's still
experience
more to
is.
the question.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, so that was the beginning of it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You mentioned about meeting each student and coming and
Yeah.
you mentioned me about meeting each student and coming up with an individually formulated
Yeah.
goals for the course. Do
Mhm.
you do this for all asynchronous course students? I think it is a great idea.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Um, you know what? I think I'm gonna take the plunge and make it a requirement in the next go around of my especially my writing and psychology course. And by the way, I developed that course. I took that course on for the first time the first semester that ChatGPT came out. So I, it's been great to see that. And this is part of it. So, as a small stakes requirement with a lot of flexibility, so it's not like, okay, Tuesday at 2 o'clock, drop what you're doing and you have to be, come in to do something. But using a calendaring program, I think using automating that because otherwise, logistically, it becomes overwhelming. So students plug it in. And sometimes I'll just say, hey, this is a time for us to talk about whatever you want. You're not expected to be prepared with some presentation or something, but I also like to say, look, haven't we all had the experience of needing to get in touch with the teacher when it's the middle of the night and you're stressed out and there's a crisis? Now you know how to book an appointment with me and what it's like to talk to me before there's any crisis. So the idea is not like, okay, check it off a box, but this is the opening of a dialogue. So through some combination of that and making it a low stakes requirement for the course that everybody talks to me for some period of time at least once, is a really important thing going forward. So I'm glad that to have that affirmation from a group like this as well.
Okay, and I think that is our time. Do you have any final remarks, Dr. Miller?
Oh, just a thanks again. The chat has been wonderful, and this is what is so important about this type of event is getting together with other people who care about the same things and have just incredible knowledge and ideas. So let's all make the most of it, and I hope we can keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for delivering this amazing keynote presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Our next session will begin at 2 o'clock. So head over to the sessions tab and choose your next session there. Thank you, everyone.